Awesome. Let's get right back into it. Really excited for Valerie to tell us a little bit about memoir and how that works with three-story method. And yeah, definitely looking forward to it. So Valerie, it seems like you're all set up and ready to go. It's all yours.
All right. I'm Valerie Isan, and I became a new certified three-story method editor just recently with these crazy people. I can't believe that was only last month. That was really great. Super exciting for me. Um, and it made me realize that I really dig story analysis. So I'm happy to be here doing that. So the cool thing about three-story method is that it works with memoirs too. You're still going to have your global conflict, choice, and consequence. You're still going to have those three C's in all of the acts, 1, 2, and 3. And yeah, writing memoir in a lot of ways is kind of like writing fiction. You're still going to have all these elements, these global conflicts, choice, and consequences. And I do use three-story method with my memoirs, and I get all of these pieces of three-story method in my memoirs. I also use Libby Hawker's book, Take Off Your Pants. I really dig the character flaw aspect of it. So you're the character in this case, and we all got flaws. So pick one that is going to resonate with the theme of your book and with the story that you want to tell. And then the death of the flaw that Libby Hawker talks about, I think is really interesting because that death of the flaw happens right before that global consequence. So, or global choice, excuse me. So your character is going on, doing the character arc thing, and they're faced with their choice. So at the moment that they make their choice, they have to, the flaw that's been keeping them back all this time now goes away. The death of the flaw happens and they're able to make that choice. I also think, and sometimes I believe this a little bit more, I also think that the character is not able to make the choice. Well, how do I say this? The global choice is right before them, and the act of making the choice is the death of the flaw. That's my belief. So if you haven't read Libby Hawker's book, I highly recommend it. It's a great resource for fiction or non. And I also use Rachel Herron's book, Fast Draft Your Memoir. Great resource. So this is actually a great resource if you don't know what you want to write about, if you just know you want to write a memoir or you'd like to try a memoir and you've never done it before. This is a great place to start. And she says to pick 5 or 10 events or memories from your life and then figure out how to fit them all together. So at the beginning, it's kind of like a big jigsaw puzzle, and you've got, you know, these little blue scenes and these rainbow scenes and these tree scenes and these edge pieces, you're going to put them aside and figure out what to do with them later. And so it's kind of a big mess when you first start contemplating writing your memoir. But you've got all these scenes, you know, you want to put them in the book, and you start organizing them and figuring out what to do with them. So because writing memoir is kind of like writing fiction with all of these elements, I want to talk more about how memoir writing is different. So we're going to talk about writing memoir, what it is, what it looks like, some of those memoir myths that new memoirists are particularly concerned about, and the structure of some memoirs and the theme, and receiving feedback. It's kind of different to receive feedback on a memoir than in a novel. Not too much different. Okay, so what is memoir? Also, I forgot to say, you can interrupt me and ask questions along the way if you want. So memoir is not an autobiography. It's not a life story. It's just a snapshot of your life, a specific place and time that you want to write about. You can have several memoirs that represent one whole life, but there's only one autobiography. And in Rachel Herron's book, she talks about the dinner party. It's a great analogy. So if you are, let me find the slide. If you're at Rachel Herron's dinner party and you're sitting in between two different people you don't know, and you've got to do the introvert, yucky, small talk thing, and you turn to the woman on your right and you try to ask her about who she is and what she's done. And she says, well, I just spent, 7 years working on a commercial fishing boat in Alaska. You're going to light up a little bit like, oh, well, why would anyone choose that profession? And what's it like being on an Alaskan fishing boat? And what's the grossest thing that happens there? And, all these questions start percolating in your mind, and you're really engaged and really excited to learn more about this thing. So that's a memoir. If you turn to the guy on your right and you do the same thing, ask him the same thing, and now he's saying, well, I was born in Missouri and my folks were poor. And well, actually, this all started 2 generations ago when my grandparents immigrated from, like, glassy eyed. This is not a dinner partner that you want to sit next to, and you can't wait to turn to the left again and get back to the commercial fishing person. So who do you want to sit next to is the question. What book are you writing? Obviously, you want to write the commercial Alaskan fishing boat, or at least that's the one you want to read, not the one about being born and raised. And so just keep that in mind when you're writing your memoir. So memoir can look like long form. Most of us are working on books right now, but it's also that personal essay. And I wrote essays for years before I realized, oh, this is a mini memoir. So you can write essays, you can write a full-length book. I think maybe poetry could also be, I think there's some poems that are memoirs, and there's obviously some poems that are fiction as well. So maybe poetry can be your flashy flash memoir, really tiny memoir. Okay, so the memoir myths or concerns that new memoirists are particularly concerned about, I wanted to focus on a little bit today. So, but it happened that way. What if I get sued? And then there's concern about family members and hurt feelings. And so we'll address that too. Okay, so, but it happened that way is not our favorite sentence to hear if we're an editor or someone that has helped us, in critiquing our book or trying to give us honest, constructive feedback. So, well, the purpose of writing our stories is to educate, to entertain, or to connect with a reader, bond with them in some way. This is true of fiction too, but in memoir, we're trying to form this connection. And in order to tell our stories, we have to borrow from the literary form. We still have to have that character arc. We still have to have the thematic arc, the narrative arc. We still have to have, plot that's interesting and pacing that's good, and the character needs to change by the end of the story. So we have to have those literary elements in our memoirs. So the way we do that is with creative license. Creative license, in this case, would be compressing time, the timeline of your story. It's really concerns with telling our own truth. And when we tell our own truths, we can use this it works with dialogue and with description too. And then also it's good to remember that memory is kind of wonky, that timey-wimey thing. So think in creative license, these 3 elements, and there's more too, but these are the 3 we'll talk about today. So compressing time. This means when you read a memoir, everything that happens in this book is true. It all happened. Maybe it's not in that order though. So we're gonna take out the confusing bits in the storyline that don't really pertain, that don't help move the story forward. We're going to take out, the boring bits of our life that don't really pertain to the message that we're trying to leave the reader with. Just like a novel, you're going to take out the parts that don't provide character development or move the story forward, or, create that pacing that we need. I wrote my first memoir, took place over, I think maybe 8 years, but that would have been a really long, boring memoir. So I took out the chunks that really didn't pertain to the message. And, even if it happened like 4 years later, I just sort of scooted it up and stuck it here in the manuscript instead to create that narrative arc that we need. So borrowing from the literary form. Telling our truths. So my sister Leslie is 4 years younger than I, and her relationship with my dad is totally different than my relationship with my dad. And even if the things that even if we are remembering a scene with my dad and we were both there, she's going to remember it differently than I remember it, because I'm seeing my dad and this experience through my own lens, through the relationship that I have with my dad. He was a totally different parent to her because I left, years earlier, and he parented differently by then. She was the last child. I was the first child. So she's going to have a different relationship. So my story is going to be different than Leslie's story, even though we're talking about the same exact thing. So if Leslie comes back and says, well, that's not what he said, it doesn't matter, because you are telling your truth. You're telling your story and the way you experienced it. So again, keeping that in mind when you're writing might bring a little bit of, peace. Doesn't matter what anybody else says. I'm just writing my story. So what if you can't remember, though? You can't just create a scene out of nowhere. If I'm writing a memoir right now about, there's a play. I need to talk about my ex-husband, and I want to portray a certain characteristic. I can't just make it up. If I just say that he was this way, that's kind of boring. I need to show, not tell. But if I can't remember a scene in my head, a memory of when this happened that shows his behavior, I can't just make it up out of thin air, because this is a memoir. We're writing true stuff. So what you do instead is you tell the truth of the moment. So it's still true. For instance, if you are writing a story about your grandmother and the conversation that you had with her about something that was really life-changing for you, but you can't remember when that conversation happened, or actually what the actual dialogue was, because it was 37 years ago and you can't really remember 37 years ago, but this thing happened. And you also know that she used to take you to the library every Thursday morning for story time, and she'd talk to you in the car on the way. And so probably, it happened then because she took you every Thursday morning. And so you create a scene on a Thursday morning, driving in the car with your grandma to the library, and you put in the dialogue that she would have said. You remember the gist of it. So that's still telling your truth. And I know that a lot of writers, memoirists at the beginning, are so hung up on, getting that actual thing, that the memory, this really happened, and I can't remember if this really happened. And it's okay. Take a breath. Just tell the truth of your story, and what comes out will be true. In terms of memory, this was from Psychology Today. I just copy and pasted it. What we remember changes each time we recall the event. The slightly changed memory is now embedded as real, only to be reconstructed with the next recall. So this is the new science. Like this is memory. And I've read this and heard this over many years now. So it's not a new thing. Every time we remember something, you're gonna remember it slightly different. and you just kind of have to go with it. Just, again, writing the truth of the moment, your experience, and that's what's important. That's what readers are seeking out, is the truth of the moment. And that's kind of part of that creative license too. You're just remembering to the best of your ability. And if you're ever uncomfortable with anything that you're writing and worried about the public's response, if you just put in that little author note at the beginning that says, hey, I've done this, this is my best of my ability, my memory, they're going to be cool with it. Okay, so what if I get sued? You're talking about libel, which is a published false statement that is damaging to a person's reputation, or a written defamation. So again, you're writing your truth. That's important. You can always change the names of people, the descriptions, their jobs. At some point, you're going to draw a line on what's okay to change and still be the truth and what's not. I think it's fine to change names and jobs and descriptions. Maybe the places where they live, you could even change. But I draw the line personally to writing composite characters. That's my personal line. That doesn't feel totally true to me. So again, you can leave that author's note at the beginning that just says you've done that. Okay, also try to take this with a little humor. You're not a celebrity and you're not writing about one. And those are the people that get sued. So not being known is a good thing in this circumstance. Stephen Pressfield wrote a book called No One Wants to Read Your Shit, which is really funny to me. And it's really accurate too. Like, just write what you need to write and the right people will find it. And until they do, again, just put it out in the world. There are people that need to hear your story. Say you wrote a book about a neighbor that was doing something illegal in the neighborhood that lived next to you, and you wanted to write a book, not to expose him, but just to tell people about your experience of having to live in a neighborhood like this. So if you're worried about your neighbor finding out, first of all, don't tell him that you wrote a book that he's in. And if he ever finds your book, and if he reads it, and if he recognizes himself in the hidden way you've put him in there, you've changed his name and his description, and if he still recognizes himself, and if he proves or could prove that someone else could recognize him through the veils, and he complains to you, then you can always just unpublish it if you're really, really, really worried about being sued. And a lot of memoirists are super worried about this at the very beginning. And it's really not something, not to diminish your fears or concerns, but it's really not something that needs to be worried about at this point. You can always unpublish it. So what about hurt feelings though? This is a little bit more important. If you're writing about a family member, how do you navigate that? So here's what I recommend in this order. Write the story anyway. Just get it out there, all of it, everything, put it there. And then edit it so that it's not just barf on the page diary entries, because sometimes that's what happens, especially in memoir. And then decide if the person in question is being represented accurately, honestly. Are they multi-dimensional? They're not just this cookie cutter villain. If you've done that and you've told your truth, you've edited the book to make it just about you and your experiences with the events around you, not trying to expose anyone or complaining about what somebody did to you. It's just your experience. Then you've got a good book here, and you can decide at some point in this time if you are more concerned about the story being out there, or if the relationship with this particular person is more important. And there isn't a right answer. It can go either way based on the person. So what does this actually mean in reality? Well, you've got the hierarchy of relationships. If I'm writing about somebody that I don't even keep in contact with anymore, and it's from a former relationship that I had, 12 years ago, and I haven't talked to this person in 7 years, I don't care what they think about what I've written. They're probably never going to read it anyway. A deceased parent, they're not going to mind what you write either. So, but the sister, maybe I'd be more concerned about what she thought about what I wrote. And definitely my spouse, I would care. And my spouse gets veto power. So I'm writing a memoir right now that he's in. So as soon as I finish it and get it all polished, I'm going to hand it to him. And if he's uncomfortable with anything, then I'll just cut it out, because my relationship with him is more important than the book, of course. So if you are trying to write something about family and you want your sister to read the parts that she's in, so she can see, okay, this is how I represented the situation and this is how you were represented too. If only do this if you're willing to change what's in the book. So just give them the chapters they're in, let them see how they've been represented, and let them be able to offer you suggestions. Like, this is the reality that I experienced. Maybe you remember it differently, but here's this chapter. If there's something in it that you're uncomfortable with, let's talk about it. Notice I didn't say, I'll cut it out, unless that's your intent and you're giving that person veto power. But you can still have a conversation. Maybe they're just upset about the way you portrayed something that's pretty superficial and it doesn't even matter in the story. So you can change it or cut it out and it doesn't bother the story at all. So yeah, checking to see if it's mandatory for the story. Is the relationship with your sister more important? That sort of thing. So those are the questions that you have to navigate and when you're writing about family or someone else that you are concerned about. Okay. Memoir structure is either going to be long or short. We talked about that. So book, personal essay. It can be written in a narrative form, or it can be a book of linked essays. So Wild Within by Melissa Hart is in narrative form. It's a book about her time volunteering at the Eugene Raptor Center and meeting her husband there, and how that time helped them decide to adopt a child from another country. So it's just it's written like a novel. You've got the narrative arc and everything. Untamed by Glennon Doyle is more like linked little episodes, little essays. Some of them are really short, but they're all about the same central theme of being yourself unapologetically, not feeling guilty for who you are. And My Life in Stitches is Rachel Herron's memoir. It's told in essays, all written based on the sweaters she was knitting at the time something happened in her life and the relationship she was in. So you can choose whichever one you want for your book. It has to be one or the other. Or you can do something kind of like a sculpture, like a vessel sort of structure to your narrative arc, or the linked essays. Eat, Pray, Love is one example. She's got 3 sections of the book. They're all in different countries. She also has this structure. I forget the name of the prayer bead necklace, but there's like 188 beads on it. And so she's got 188 little chapters, quote unquote. And Made from Scratch is another book I really love by Jenna, something with a W. She had she was a cubicle worker and quit everything and went and became a farmer. And I used to read her blog back in the day. And she wrote her book, her memoir was a personal essay about how fun it was to raise chickens and how cool they are and what she learns about herself by watching her chickens in the yard. And then the next chapter was an article on like the logistics of raising chicks and raising chickens and that sort of thing. And so her whole memoir was structured that way. So you can do a narrative arc just like a novel. You can do the linked essays. So they're individual memories or essays, but they're all linked by a common thread. Or you can create something else that's totally unique and creative, like some of these other examples. Okay. I'm going to retitle this slide to say CJP's talk, because he just did this whole amazing thing about theme and story hypothesis and armature. So I feel like this is really redundant. However, I do want to say that for memoir, I feel like theme is even more important in memoir than in fiction, because the takeaway message, the why did I read this book, is really important to me personally as a reader of memoir. I love the genre of memoir and I read a lot of it because I read fiction to learn about myself. I see characters in scenarios that I would never be in places that I've never been to, with circumstances that I would never be involved in or have myself placed in. And I am so curious to know how they maneuver through that. And it invites self-reflection. I want to see how they did that so that I could check in with myself. Well, what would I do in that circumstance? How would I behave? That's really interesting. I wonder if I would do it differently. And I read memoir to find out how I could do something. It's almost like a how-to. So I'm reading their true story, this ordinary person in these extraordinary circumstances, and they got out of it. Usually I'm reading the memoir because it's a setting that resonates with me, or it's the same story, like I'm going through this too. I want to know how she got through it so that I can do the same thing and get through this too. When I was 26, my husband died and I was pregnant and I had a 22-month-old also. And this was pre 9/11. So there weren't any young widow memoirs out there at the time. And I didn't know how to be a widow at 26. Like all the widows I knew were old. So I turned to books. That was the first thing I went to. And since there weren't very many out there, I read the two that resonated with my circumstances and read them greedily. I wanted to know what they did so that I could meander through my own minefield at the time and get through that grief. So I read fiction to learn about myself. I read memoir to know what to do. That's me personally. And I'm sure every reader is going to read for a different reason, but probably some of them read like I do too. So it's really important to me to know that what is in the memoir is true, and that the theme that I'm taking away, the message that I'm taking away from the book, is one that will give me purpose, or one that will make me feel empowered. I want to close the book and think, yes, I'm going to go do this too, or something to that effect. I don't want to close the book and think, oh, why did I read that? And I've read both of those memoirs. So I want to write the memoir that makes the reader empowered and feel really excited about, yes, this was a great story and I'm going to go do it too. So in that sense, I think that theme is a little bit more important in memoir than in fiction, because I can read fiction and have it not have a central theme that's noticeable at all, but still be riveted. And there's a book that I've read 4 times, Motherless Brooklyn by Jonathan Lethem. Fantastic character, so amazing. It blows my mind every time I read. It's a detective story. It's kind of a meh plot, and I don't even ever remember how it ends. That's how bad the story ending was. But I keep reading it because the character is so engaging. So that would not fly in a memoir for me. So it's really important that the theme, the takeaway message is a good one. And it really empowers the reader at the end of the book. I also help other writers find the core of their memoir. That's one of my specialties. So I can help any of you do that as well. In terms of receiving feedback, remembering it's not about you. I mean, this is true of any novel too. The feedback you get is constructive. It's about the story. It's not about you, the author. And sometimes it's hard to separate ourselves from the feedback that we get from our editors. And when it comes to memoir, it's harder because, you know, you are the character. But if you can create some separation and remember, it's not about you, it's about the character you. It's about the character's flaw, the character's journey. And if you use those words when you're talking to your editor, use third person pronouns, use the word character when you're talking about yourself to your editor, that will help give you some distance to that. And that I find helps when I talk to my editor. And then the standard rules apply also. Take time to process the notes you get from your editor. Maybe you have to take a little bit longer this time because it's a memoir and not a novel, but just be compassionate with yourself. Ask the clarifying questions. So if the feedback you get is this spot is not believable, your knee-jerk reaction might be, but it happened that way. I was there. How can that not be believable? I was there. It happened. I know it. Instead of getting ramped up like that, you can ask more clarifying questions like, well, how can I rewrite the scene so that it is believable, because it's important in the book and I would like it to be believable. What made it not believable? So asking those clarifying questions might help you get over some of those knee-jerk reactions. And then of course, thank your editor. So that's me. Is there any other questions?
Yeah. At what point do you think the memoir stops being like a memoir and more of a story? Because I've read some where they could be almost more story than an actual memoir. It follows like a long time frame.
So when you say story, do you mean what do you mean
Like
by
more,
story? Book?
yeah, more of something,
Do you mean fiction?
yeah, where it almost picks up that fiction vibe.
Well, I think that's why it's really important to have some sort of author note at the beginning that lets the reader know what is not as true as other parts. Like if you're writing about an ex-boyfriend that's super private, okay, I've changed the name and the location of this person, of this character in the book for privacy's sake. So the reader knows, okay, if that's the only thing that's changed, then everything else in here is true. Because it's so important to me as a reader of memoir to know that what's in there is actually true, I would feel betrayed if I got to a place in the story and was like, what? Wait a minute. I don't think so. So if you are going to tweak it a little bit, there's a new genre that wants to form these days called autofiction, I think, where it's kind of like a mix between the two, which I think you should just fictionalize it if you don't want to write a memoir personally. I don't think the autofiction should be a thing, but you know, zeitgeist and all, whatever. So yeah, if you're going to tweak it to more fictional, then that needs to be very clear at the beginning. And so you can write it however you want to, as long as you communicate with the reader. I don't feel like I quite answered your question. What part am I leaving out?
No, it made sense to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna unshare if I can figure out how to stop sharing. Any other questions?
I had a quick question about the compressing time and all that.
Mhm.
So I started writing like the first story of something, and it's about my Aikido time and how my martial arts training has informed my writing and stuff. And so the first story is like takes place around like one of the white belts tests. But I took pieces from like, so I sat through a million of those. And so I took pieces from each, like it didn't all have, all the stuff that happens in this original story didn't all happen in this one testing period, but it all happened and it's all true. I just condensed it. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Like
That's
it's still
exactly
true
right,
to my
yes.
story. I just didn't want to have
Yeah,
five
think of
different.
think of an editing, you're editing a clip in iMovie. So you're gonna like do a split clip here and you're gonna take out this part and you're gonna reduce the volume over here and you're gonna move this piece over here and you're gonna do a crossfade over here, and that's memoir writing.
Okay.
And that's novel writing too. I really feel like memoir writing is, you go through the same process writing a novel, I think.
Oh, thanks.
Any other bits and bobs?
Val, I have one question I want to ask for a friend.
Okay.
He's he started and stopped the memoir a number of times, has a collection of essays saved, and feels really self-indulgent and navel gazing when he comes back to him. What should I tell him?
I think that's where theme gets really important. So the first memoir I wrote was about the time after my husband died. And I felt I had a really strong motive for writing it. And I had a really strong desire to reach those particular people. And I knew exactly what I was going to write. And it was important. And I had a message that I wanted to get across. With this memoir that I'm working on right now, it was too amorphous. And I kept thinking as I was writing it, like, why am I writing this? No one's going to like this. There's no, I don't know. I was really mehing out on this one and had some of those thoughts of like, well, why would anyone care? And I'm just like kvetching and whatever, And so that changed when I pulled back out and thought, okay, what is the theme? What is the message? What is that story hypothesis? Thank you, JP. I'm going to start using that for this particular project. And having that be strong helps you pull out of the navel gazing, I think. And I also think it's hard to write in scene in memoir. It's more difficult, I think, because we're so used to like just telling our story. And when you're first drafting, of course, that's what comes out is just a bunch of summary. And so then you have to create scenes. And I think that the structure of it also, like if what you have is a bunch of essays, let it be essays. It doesn't have to be narrative arc if that's not what's showing up. I think that if again, you try to pull yourself out a little bit and you're writing about a character, not about yourself. It's not your story anymore. It's the character's story. And you do things and you make decisions about the structure of your book for the story's sake, then I think that helps also take out some of that. Why would anyone want to read this navel gazing stuff? Did that answer?
Thanks, Val. I'll be sure to let him know.
Okay. Anything else?
That was really great, Valerie. I found it really helpful.
Good.
Because I'm writing a nonfiction book, but the intro has to be like, why am I writing this? So, and I never thought of it as, in a sense, the introduction being a memoir essay, but it will be. It's like, this is why I'm writing this. This is my experience, So I really, I just really appreciate it. You've filled in some missing pieces for me.
Ooh, right on. Thank you. I had some
thanks. It was
imposter
such a great, long view too, overview of the memoir process and what's involved, and was really helpful. My friend's going to love it.
Thank you. I hope you didn't hear my dogs barking the entire time. They didn't stop once. And at the beginning, it was really distracting.
You just powered right through it though. You just kept going.
What I tried to do. Yeah, I have a pit bull mix that does that when he walks. No matter what kind of harness or gentle lead we put on him, he just powers right through it. So Pitbull through your presentations, people. How's that for alliteration?
Well done. Thank you, Val. Thanks for sharing that. It was great. You and JP really brought your A game. Thanks to both of you for sharing with us today. That was excellent.